Hello class, today we're going to be discussing Chapter 9, which looks at community-based programs, specifically looking at delinquency prevention, looking at diversion, community programs, and residential treatment programs. So the learning objectives for today are that by the end, you should be able to summarize the philosophy and objectives of community-based corrections, explain how community-based programs are administered, explain the importance of delinquency prevention, describe diversion and various diversion programs, describe residential programs in the community, as well as evaluate the effectiveness of community-based programs. All right, so let's look at the philosophy behind community-based corrections. So we look at reintegration, which assumes that an offender and community must be changed at the same time, because the community plays a vital role in reabsorbing that offender back into the community. So here we have a maintenance of family bonds, employment and education, and placement in mainstream social life, which is important. It's also important to have a continuum of sanctions, which is essentially a range of sentencing options available to the court. These are things from diversion to probation to residential facilities. So the severity of the punishment should equal the severity of the crime, which we also covered in Chapter 8. So you have those intermediate sanctions where you're going to have an escalation in punishment as the behavior escalates. And then we have the idea of restorative justice and peacemaking, which again, we've already talked about, but this is where you take on a humanistic treatment of offenders. So you're going to focus on healing the victim, offender reintegration, and community restoration. You can have things such as victim-offender conferencing and community restitution programs to accomplish this. So there's 3 different types of administration of community-based programs. The first one being comprehensive state-sponsored. So we have these Community Corrections Acts, which we also talked about before, that will subsidize the county funding for residential and day treatment programs. So sometimes local and state agencies have constrained budgets, so they're unable to provide adequate or enough programs, and therefore they'll contract with private companies so that they can offer a greater continuum of care or continuum of services. So the next one is going to be then our local sponsored here, where they're county-based and the services are sponsored by the juvenile court. But again, sometimes they can't afford to do that adequately. So then we get into the third one, which is private programs. So the juvenile court will actually contract with private service providers to provide different services, different treatment, different programs, so that you can have that continuum of care and that escalating punishments or sanctions based on the offender's behavior. So these private programs get their funding from federal, state, or local jurisdictions. They can also get a portion from insurance providers, as well as the juvenile's parents or guardians. When we have youth that are placed in a residential treatment facility, they require placement, the parent is actually going to be called by domestic relations and they're going to have to prove how much money they make. And they're going to determine whether that parent is going to pay essentially child support to the placement for having to house and treat and provide care for that child during that time. So we have a lot of our higher socioeconomic status families that don't realize this. And they say, place my kid, they're not listening to the rules at home. And then they realize that they're going to have to pay for part of that. Then they tend to change their tune. So this is one of those things that you also want to keep in mind when you're talking with a family and talking with the child, letting them know up front that, hey, look, they're going to be looking at how much you make. And it's possible that if we can't correct this behavior in the home and in the community, you're going to be responsible for a portion of these services. And I know some families that have paid even upwards of $1,000 a month for their child to be in placement. And there's no option for the parent to say, oh, I don't want my kid to go. The court orders the juvenile to placement, and therefore it falls on the parent a portion of that responsibility. So what types of community programs do we have? Well, there's 2 examples from the text, Safe Futures and Project Craft. So Safe Futures was actually funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and its goal was to seek to improve service delivery by creating a continuum of care that was responsive to the needs of the youth as well as the families at various points along the point of juveniles reintegrating into society. And then you had Project Craft, which was funded by the Home Builders Institute, and this gave pre-apprenticeship training and job training to delinquent juveniles. Looking at their recidivism rates and how successful this program was, in the first year after the child was released from the program, they had a 15% rate of recidivism. In year 2, they had only a 10%, and in year 3, a 1% recidivism rate. So this was pretty good for a community-based program, showing that we had long-term recidivism reductions, not simply just immediate reductions in recidivism. Again, because we know that providing employment opportunities and job training is one of the key factors in helping youth to not commit more crime. So let's look at delinquency prevention. How can we even stop a juvenile from coming into the system at all? So delinquency prevention is described or defined as attempts to thwart juveniles' illegal behavior before it even begins. So there's 3 ways this can be done. We have primary prevention, which is when we modify conditions in the physical and social environment so that an offender doesn't have the opportunity to offend. I should say a youth doesn't have the opportunity to offend and become an offender. Secondary prevention is focused on early identification and intervention in the lives of individuals or groups who exist in criminogenic circumstances. So these would be considered like your at-risk youth. Youth who live in high crime neighborhoods, high crime areas, maybe who come from families that have a history of criminal behavior. So we want to identify those and provide interventions and services. Then we have tertiary prevention, and this is just simply prevention of recidivism. So this is your offenders who have already committed a delinquent act, and we want to prevent them from future reoffending. So if you look at page 192 in your text, it actually shows a chart of different model programs and promising programs. So model programs are ones that have showed through various research that they work, they reduce recidivism, and they're ones that you want to model future programs off of. Then we have promising programs that there's not quite as much research on, but they're showing great reductions in recidivism and changing behavior. So model programs are your big name ones that you've heard of, such as Big Brothers and Big Sisters, functional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy, and life skills training. Then some promising ones have been things such as strengthening families, brief strategic family therapy, and guiding good choices. So we have this mobilization of youth program, which actually improved educational and employment opportunities for youth in the area that this was created in. And they made a variety of services available not only to youth, but also to the families. Again, I know a lot of you in class, like probably 3/4 of you, are focusing on the family circumstances and impact that has on juvenile offending. So you might want to look at things like this. They also provided assistance to community organizations to specifically help bolster those community organizations that they were going to refer youth to. So how do we prevent violent juvenile and delinquency prevention? So we want to target the majority of our prevention and diversion programs at violent high-risk youth. High-risk offenders commit roughly 75% of all violent juvenile offenses. So this is why we want to make sure that we're targeting them with the most and majority of our programs. It also requires a strong collaboration between agencies to have a comprehensive approach. So we're targeting the youth at all angles from all sides. We need to match accountability with sanctions, with intensive treatment, and with rehabilitation services. You want to make sure you have all 4 of these components happening. So there's 4 key prevention things here. We're going to address the key areas of risk. We're going to strengthen personal and institutional factors of the youth. So things such as their school as an institution, the family as an institution, and personal, just the youth themselves. We also want to make sure that we're providing adequate supervision and support through probation or things like aftercare services or intensive services. And then you want to offer a long-term stay for youth in the community through offering of multiple programs in their community setting to keep them out of placement. So diversion, how do we divert youth to keep them out of formal court processing? Well, so justice subsystems typically retain control over diverted youth or diverted offenders so that we can return these youth to court when they violate. So it's a matter of keeping them out of the system, but kind of just out on the side, hanging out, so that we can make sure that if in fact they do start to violate or they're not following through with the conditions that they were given for diversion, that we can bring them right back into court and start applying those graduated sanctions and responses to their behavior. So voluntary participation is a huge part of diversion, okay? Voluntary participation. The youth has to want to be diverted. So you have 3 different examples here of diversion. You have youth courts, where youth are sentenced by a jury of their peers. These are typically for your first-time offenders, youth between the ages of 11 and 17, who commit misdemeanor nonviolent offenses. Okay, nonviolent offenses. So community service is a common disposition that's given here. And some common charges we have are things like theft, misdemeanor assault, disorderly conduct, possession of alcohol. Then we have juvenile drug courts and mental health courts, which we're going to talk more about. But here you have to have a collaboration between the judge, the prosecution, the defense, the juvenile, multiple service providers, and they're mostly cost effective. Then we have mediation programs. So mediation programs are where all involved parties are going to come together to resolve their differences without having the court involved. So a mediator is going to run these sessions rather than a judge, and these are for youth during school age, so roughly 6 to 18 years of age, and these are for status and nonviolent offenses. So these are your more lower level offenses. Okay, so now we're going to get into drug courts. So what is a drug court? A drug court is comprehensive with a focus on the functioning of the juvenile within the family. So there's a greater coordination among agencies with these types of courts, and you have a more active judicial supervision over the case. So the judge is going to take a very active role in the juvenile's entire case and not simply just in a hearing and a judicial capacity of making a decision. I apologize. My dog apparently wants to play. So you also have an increased use of immediate sanctions for noncompliance here. So we know we want swift and severe and certain sanctions, right? So it's easier to do this in drug courts because the offender is going to be essentially in a hearing, typically sometimes as much as once a week. So it's a very active approach. So a couple goals of drug courts are that it's going to provide immediate intervention treatment as well as structured monitoring. It will improve the juvenile's functioning to address problems related to their drug use. It'll provide them with the skills to be able to lead drug-free lives. For example, skills to avoid certain areas, avoid certain triggers, avoid certain people, so that they don't even come into contact with the drugs. It's going to strengthen the families and provide them with structure and guidance for that youth. And it promotes accountability. Because there's immediate sanction, so youth are more accountable more quickly, and they learn quicker to adjust their behavior. So mental health courts, very similar to drug courts, and here we have a cooperation and collaboration among a multidisciplinary team. By that we mean we have the judge, defense, juvenile, but we also have service providers. So you're going to have mental health providers, psychologists, their treatment providers that are going to be involved in this process to make sure that the youth is following the proper treatment plan. So a couple goals are to decrease recidivism, as well as increase the juvenile's adherence to treatment. So things such as medication management, attending their therapy or counseling sessions. So here we're going to watch a video of how a mental health court works, and I know they're adults, but it's the same idea.
The Brooklyn Mental Health Court is a court that works with people living with serious and persistent mental illness, started in 2002. The mental health court was unique at the time in the sense that criminally accused individuals that lived with a mental illness basically had two options. One, they could plead what's commonly referred to as not guilty by reason of insanity, or the individual could go to trial or plead guilty and receive a prison term. The mental health court represented a third way, that the individual could come to the court, agree to go into treatment, and avoid jail as a recognition that the mental illness played some part in the criminal behavior.
From day one, there's been this view of every single person who comes into the court is worthy of respect, is a person with inherent dignity, and the court communicates that in every way it possibly can.
We have a great judge in there who also understands that our clients have different needs. He speaks to them like they're people. He speaks to them like he cares about them.
The Brooklyn Mental Health Court helps us resolve cases in a way that's right and just.
It really looks at these people as individuals with a major problem that can be addressed within the community rather than just as a criminal.
These individuals are now people in the community who are doing well, who have families, who have jobs, who are in school.
My life before the program, it was hectic. Ups and downs, drugs, all type of stuff.
Before I came to mental health court, my life was pretty much in shambles. I was homeless. I was struggling to take care of my children. I basically was making choices that were desperate.
It's about reducing hospitalizations. It's about reducing new arrests. It's about maintaining psychiatric stability.
The Brooklyn Mental Health Court is, I'm going to use the term person-centered. It's about that individual. It's not about a number.
Brooklyn Mental Health Court is a place where you could recuperate and take care of what you got to take care of. Stay sober.
When it started, it was a smaller court, and it has grown to be able to take in many more cases.
We have successfully diverted 1,000 mentally ill adults from incarceration into treatment in the community.
1,000 graduates. That's an awesome feat, man. And the thing is, they stay reconnected. Like, I can say at least 20 of my clients easily call me back. Hi, Mr. Thomas, how you doing? I'm checking on you. Oh, I'm great, thank you. It's a rewarding feeling.
When I graduated mental health court, my life was coming together. I got employment. My kids are going to college. My kids are doing great. They're watching me, make big strides toward my goals.
We often see lives changed after they've been through Brooklyn Mental Health Court.
My life now is full of hopes and dreams and aspirations that are limitless. I feel I've accomplished being in a stable place, and I'm happy. Brooklyn Mental Health Court is encouraging. It's an inspiration.
So what I hope you got from that is that these courts are there to help. Again, they're diversionary. So the goal is to keep youth and or adults in this case out of incarceration and keep them in their communities. But also, like the one individual said, they're person-centered. So we really want to make sure that we're focusing on that individual person and improving their life circumstances, not just making sure that we're pushing a certain number through. So what are some mediation programs? So in mediation programs, a mediator is going to determine three things. So we're switching gears here. We're going to mediation programs. This is where the mediator is going to determine the level of sincerity of remorse the juvenile has for their act. They're going to look at what's a fair and just sentence to give this offender, and what services, if any, are necessary. To partake in a mediation program, the juvenile must first admit guilt. They have to admit that they've done some act that's against the crimes code, okay? So in this case, they're also going to relinquish the right to have witnesses or an attorney present. Because remember, it's not a juvenile court process. It's prior to that. Typically, they're going to be no longer than 90 days in length. And the outcomes for these are that you can have three. You can have successful, unsuccessful outcome, or dismissal of the charges. So in successful, the juvenile completes the full program, they followed all of the rules they were supposed to. If they're unsuccessfully discharged, that means the juvenile failed to meet all of the program requirements. And then case dismissal. This is where the case is dismissed prior to a disposition being entered. So prior to them being placed on the program, they dismiss the charges. So let's get into residential programs. So residential programs, there's three major types. We have day treatment programs, group homes, and wilderness programs. In day treatment programs, they're non-residential and they don't provide living or sleeping quarters for the youth. We're going to get more into detail on each of these in the next few slides. Then we have group homes. These are residential placements for youth on probation or once they're released from a training school. So there's two ways they can go to a group home. And then wilderness programs are going to use the wilderness around them, whether it's the desert, sea, even urban areas, to allow a youth to gain self-reliance, to prove their worth, and help define their personhood. So day treatment programs. This is where a youth is going to spend the day at the program, but they're going to go home in the evenings. They're more cost-effective because of this than regular residential programs are. And they generally serve male populations, however there are some that serve females. An example of this was the Associated Marine Institute, now known as AMI Kids. Here we have individual goals that are related to diving, ship handling, different ship handling skills, first aid, even photography of marine life. So they would provide these youth specifically related to marine life, different skills. But now AMI Kids provides a variety of services. So they have things such as substance abuse, after-school programs, they even got into the wilderness programs we'll talk about, and volunteering. So now let's talk about group homes. Group homes are going to be a single dwelling that's owned or rented by an organization or an agency for the sole purpose of housing offenders. So typically they're not going to be called foster parents, but you'll have house parents or counselors that reside in the home with the youth, and they're essentially going to act as parents or mentors to them. So the appearance is going to look just like a regular house. You wouldn't be able to distinguish this from any other house on the block. And they utilize the community to offer resources and services to the youth to give it that home-like feeling. They're treatment-oriented, and they'll use things such as guided group interaction, or GGI, to help the youth develop positive pro-social group culture so they can understand what it's like to work within groups, to work within essentially like a family setting. So we have a couple purposes. One, it's an alternative to institutionalization for dependent, neglected, non-criminal, or low-level delinquent youth. It's also a short-term placement option, and you can have youth that are halfway in or halfway out. So halfway in are youth who are having trouble following conditions of supervision, and they might step them up into a group home. Your halfway out youth is going to be a transition for a youth between them going from an institution or residential placement and coming home on probation. So an example of this is the House of Umoja project, where this woman's son got involved with gangs. So she actually invited those gang members to stay in the home with them to learn how to work as an extended family. They also learned about family strengths, tribal concepts, and the African value system. Youth in this program or project had to remain drug-free and were also encouraged to maintain good grades. And now for our last type of program, wilderness programs. These are also referred to as survival programs, where a youth is going to work on building their strength and self-reliance through seemingly impossible tasks. So it helps youth gain experiences that they may otherwise have not been exposed to, particularly if you have youth who live in urban areas. They may have never gone and visited a forest before or seen a desert before. They may have never been camping before. So an example of this is Outward Bound, and in this program they would do things such as mountain walking, backpacking, camping, and rock climbing. We also do have some other programs now. So let me back up. These can be community or residential based programs. Ones in the community, youth actually has programming in the community, and maybe on nights or weekends, they'll go into different wilderness type programs and do those more wilderness activities. You also have full wilderness programs where youth will sleep on the weekends. I'm sorry, so this would be an example of a community-based wilderness program. They're home during the week, and on the weekends they come to the program, and they actually sleep in sleeping bags up in these almost like tree stands. They're just basically wood platforms with a roof over it, but they're open air. They actually sleep in sleeping bags, whether it's rain or shine. So it's pretty cool. It gives them an experience and also gives them accountability. So you say, Johnny, you're not following the rules of probation here. You keep violating your curfew. Maybe we tried the GPS and that's still not working. You still continue to hang out with other delinquent youth. So now it's time to remove you from your community on the weekends and have you participate in this wilderness program. So if you don't want to sleep outside, maybe next time you won't violate your programming. So how effective are these community-based programs? Well, they reduce recidivism and they're less expensive than confining a youth 24/7. They improve the continuum of community-based services because it requires an emphasis on deinstitutionalization. Institutionalization should also only be used for serious violent offenders. So there are some arguments that have been made that even keeping the most serious offenders in the community for treatment is possible if you have the right community-based program. And then this idea of graduated responses. So we must try the least restrictive first and gradually increase in severity of sanctions up to placement. You never want to just start right out of placement. So in sum, we have 3 philosophies that guide community-based programming, including reintegration, necessity for continuum of sanctions, and restorative justice and peacemaking. We have 3 types of organizational structures in community-based programming, including comprehensive state-sponsored, locally sponsored, and private programs. Delinquency prevention attempts to thwart youth behavior before it becomes delinquent, while diversion programs aim to keep youth out of the formal juvenile justice system processing. So we have 3 types of community and residential treatment programs. These are day treatment, group homes, and wilderness programs. And lastly, community-based programs can reduce recidivism greater than residential programs for certain types of youth. So that was your Chapter 9 lesson. I'm also going to post the PDF version of this to your module this week. If you have any questions, again, always feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call.